Good morning, everyone. Welcome to another episode of BNN with Bhante Suddhāso. Good morning to Kevin, Gita, Jens, Boone. Buenos dias, Marielle. And hello, Leo and Scott. So today, the Daylong will be focused on mindfulness of feelings. So building from yesterday's practice on mindfulness of the body, Bhante will be going through the second part of the Satipaṭṭhāna Sutta. You'll find the link in the live chat of his translation. So you can study along, and if you have any questions, you can put them in the live chat and Bhante will address them later. And welcome to Ryan, Sally, James, Gabriella. And Ryan says, I only have a few hours of work on my plate today, so I might actually get to participate. Wonderful.
Great. Ready?
Yes, and hello, Junie. Sally says, so happy to have another Satipaṭṭhāna Sutta. I guess study. Mm-hmm. Oh, and welcome Nora as well. Okay, so we can start.
Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namassami. Good morning, friends. So we're continuing our investigation of the Satipaṭṭhāna Sutta, and the way Ayasoma scheduled this was that we would be devoting an entire day to each one of the four Satipaṭṭhanas, which doesn't actually work terribly well with the sutta because the first section on mindfulness of the body is pretty long. The second section on mindfulness of Vedana, of feeling, is extremely short. The third section, mindfulness of the mind, is also quite short. And then the fourth section, mindfulness of mental objects, is extremely long. So we'll see how well this actually plays out in reality. So today's session might be very short, which is okay. It means more time for meditation practice. So as usual, I'll read through the section of the sutta and explain a bit about what it's talking about. And then we can have some discussion about how to apply this in our Buddhist practice. So first off, the Buddha says, monks, how does a monk abide observing feelings as feelings? Monks, when a monk is feeling a pleasant feeling, he understands, I am feeling a pleasant feeling. When feeling an unpleasant feeling, he understands, I am feeling an unpleasant feeling. When feeling a neutral feeling, he understands, I am feeling a neutral feeling. When feeling a physical pleasant feeling, he understands, I am feeling a physical pleasant feeling. When feeling a non-physical pleasant feeling, he understands, I am feeling a non-physical pleasant feeling. When feeling a physical painful feeling, same. Non-physical painful feeling, a physical neutral feeling, or non-physical neutral feeling. In each case, he understands it for what it is. In this way, one abides observing feelings as feelings internally, or one abides observing feelings as feelings externally, or one abides observing feelings as feelings both internally and externally, or one abides observing the nature of manifestation in relation to feelings, or one abides observing the nature of cessation in relation to feelings, or one abides observing the nature of both manifestation and cessation in relation to feelings. Or mindfulness that there are feelings is established to the extent necessary for knowledge and awareness, and one abides independent, and one does not cling to anything in the world. Monks, in this way, a monk abides observing feelings as feelings. That's it. That's the whole section on mindfulness of feeling. So we can go into meditation practice now. Anyway, so a little bit of explanation here. First off, the Pali word feeling is Vedana. So Vedana comes from the root vid, which means to know, to see, or to find. It's the same root from which we get words like vidya, which means knowledge, true knowledge. It's also where we get the word Veda, which means a body of knowledge, a body of knowing. But in this case, Vedana simply has the meaning of what's sometimes called the tone of a sensation, namely whether that sensation is identified as pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. So people often mistake feelings as meaning emotions, but emotions actually fits under the third and fourth Satipatthāna. It doesn't fit under feeling. So Vedana, again, refers specifically to the experience of pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral. And the only extra layer that the Buddha adds in this sutta is the distinction between physical feelings and non-physical feelings. So the Pali words here are samisa, which literally means meaty, connected with meat, namely this chunk of meat right here, and niramisa, which means not meaty, not involving meat, which once again means not involving your physical body. So some translators get very into this idea of samisa and niramisa. So you might see this translated as carnal and spiritual, but I think that's kind of missing the point. The point is just whether or not it's a feeling which is directly related to the body. So there are two kinds of feelings. There are physical feelings and there are non-physical feelings. There are things which are directly related to the body and things which are only in the domain of the mind. So, for example, sadness is an unpleasant feeling that is not physical. It's something that's experienced in the mind. Whereas if you step on a sharp object, then that's a painful feeling that is physical. It's something that's experienced through the body. So that's more the distinction that I believe the Buddha is making here, is this distinction between physical and non-physical sensations. And so what he's prescribing here is actually something which is very simple and direct. When a feeling arises, to know what it is, to know whether it's pleasant, painful, or neutral, and to know whether it's physical or non-physical. Then he recommends, starting from that point, to observe feelings as feelings internally and externally. So once again, in terms of the body, that was being explained in terms of the inside of the body as well as the external layer of the body, which applies equally as well to dealing with the feelings, the Vedana, that arise in relationship to the body. Observing the nature of appearing and vanishing of feelings. And this is particularly important if one is caught in obsession with feeling, which most of us are, realistically. We love to attach to pleasant things and hate unpleasant things and ignore neutral things. That's kind of what we do. So this morning we had a lovely breakfast. So there was attachment to the pleasant sensation of eating the nice breakfast. Or maybe you didn't like your breakfast so much and you're attached to the unpleasantness of your breakfast. Maybe you had oatmeal for breakfast and you were like, how hideous is this? Oatmeal again. Or maybe you had a nice lemon cake and you're like, oh, how lovely is this? Fantastic, delicious. Finally, something worth eating for breakfast. Well, what are we actually doing there? We're personalizing something which is not personal. We're making a perfectly normal aspect of bodily experience, namely a sensation arising in dependence upon external conditions, and we're blowing it out of proportion. We're taking this perfectly ordinary experience of sensation. So in this case, the sensation of tasting oatmeal or the sensation of tasting lemon cake. And then there's a feeling that arises. And the feeling arises based on our past conditioning, based on our karma, based on our memories, based upon, actually to a large degree, based on our sanya, based on our perception. But I'll get into that another time, perhaps. So based on all of that, we identify certain things as pleasant and certain other things as painful and certain other things as neutral. But that's technically something extra that we're adding to the experience. The experience itself is not painful. The experience itself is not pleasant. The experience itself is not neutral. The experience itself is simply information. It's just raw data. So what we can start to recognize is when sensations occur, recognize that first there is the sensation, then there is a tendency to react to the sensation with either desire, aversion, or apathy. And that's what we call Vedana. It's not the sensation itself, but it's the reactive tendency to that sensation. And that reactive tendency is something which is actually purely mental. So this is something which is needs to be explored a bit more closely. So the Buddha talks about physical feelings and non-physical feelings. But a more precise way of talking about this would be feelings related to physical sensation and feelings related to non-physical sensations. Or reactive tendencies related to physical sensation and reactive tendencies related to non-physical sensation. Of course, that's a little bit verbally clunky, but it communicates the meaning a bit more precisely. So again, we have a sensory experience of some sort. So whether something through the body or something through the mind, whether it's a physical object or a mental object. And then we have a tendency to react to that with either liking, disliking, or apathy. And that creates the experience of pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral. So to be aware of that, to be aware of the arising of feeling in the sense of pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral, coming from desire. So this is laid out very clearly in Paticca Samuppada, independent origination, where the Buddha goes through an explanation of how our experience arises moment by moment. Avijja paccaya sankhara, sankhara paccaya vijnana, vijnana paccaya namarupa, namarupa paccaya namarupa paccaya salayatana, salayatana paccaya passo, passa paccaya vedana, vedana paccaya tanha, tanha paccaya upadana, upadana paccaya bhavo, bhava paccaya jati, jati paccaya jara marana, sokapari deva dukkha domanassa, upayasa upajanti. So the bit that we're talking about here is the part right in the middle, which is often the part of Paticca Samuppada that gets the most attention because it's the part that we can most clearly see in each moment, which is Passapaccaya Vedana. So from sense Yeah, so from sense contact arises feeling, from feeling arises craving, from craving arises clinging, and from that comes the whole mass of dukkha. So there's some kind of sensory contact, but the sensory contact precedes the arising of Vedana. So it's two distinctly separate things. And then the Vedana arises, and then from that, then we get caught in the whole cycle of attachment and aversion and obsession and liking and disliking and so on. So that's not doing us any good. It just creates this ongoing experience of discontent. So through recognizing clearly the arising of Vedana and recognizing that the preceding sensation is not the Vedana, that Vedana is a mental addition to sensations. Through clearly seeing that, then we can also recognize that the arising of Vedana is optional. So this is clearly laid out in another sutta, and I'm just going to briefly pull it up because it illustrates this point very neatly. There's a short sutta where the Buddha speaks about exactly this subject. And in particular, he talks about the ability that we have to train ourselves in seeing pleasant feelings as painful, seeing painful feelings as pleasant, or as going entirely beyond both pleasant and unpleasant. So the sutta I'm referring to is the Tikandaki Sutta, which is in Guttara Nikaya 5.144. And you can actually find this on my website. It's listed there as well. So in the sutta, the Buddha says, monks, from time to time, it is good for a monk to dwell perceiving the non-repulsive as repulsive. From time to time, it is good for a monk to dwell perceiving the repulsive as non-repulsive. From time to time, it is good for a monk to dwell perceiving both non-repulsive and repulsive as repulsive. From time to time, it is good for a monk to dwell perceiving both repulsive and non-repulsive as non-repulsive. From time to time, it is good for a monk to circumvent both repulsive and non-repulsive and dwell equanimous, mindful, and clearly aware. So I probably wouldn't use the word repulsive these days. So I think I'm just going to briefly pull up the Pali for this and see if I might handle that slightly differently these days. So the word the Buddha used for this is patikula. So patikula, so pati means against or away from. And kula literally means sloping or inclination. So patikula means inclining away from something, leaning away from something. So repulsive is perhaps a little bit excessively strong as a translation. It's more like the tendency to pull back from something, tendency to lean away from something. So in the context of feelings, Vedana, we can notice that some sensations we have a tendency to pull back from. We have a tendency to lean away from them, to try to feel them less intensely, to try to reduce or avoid them. And interestingly enough, for some people, this is actually things which would ordinarily be pleasant. Some people have an aversive reaction to pleasant experiences. And conversely, some people have a peculiar fascination with painful experiences. So that further complicates this matter, in that often we have a mixture of attraction and repulsion to any given experience, to any given sensation. And the Buddha also addresses that in this sutta. He mentions things which are both repulsive and non-repulsive, things which we both have a tendency to lean away from and towards. So he's also clearly aware that there is such a thing as having a mixed response or a mixed reaction to a sensation. But the important thing about this sutta, the Tikandaki Sutta, is that the Buddha emphasizes that we have the ability to break our reactive tendencies towards Vedana. We have the ability to get control over it, to train ourselves, to see things which normally we would find repellent, things that normally we would lean away from. Instead, we can lean into them. Things that normally we would lean into, we can lean away from. And things which we have mixed feelings about, we can train ourselves to either lean away from them or into them as we wish. And ultimately, we can arrive at a stage of equanimity where we neither lean into nor away from any particular sensation or experience. So that's the practice here. And it starts with clearly understanding what we're feeling. And clearly understanding necessitates being clearly aware. So where this comes up most often during meditation practice is with physical pain. Often that's the first major issue that comes up. So for example, Gabriella's been talking about how she has chronic physical pain, which makes it difficult for her to practice mindfulness of the body. Well, that's quite common. Even if you don't have a chronic health condition, most people who practice meditation eventually encounter physical pain, usually within a few minutes of sitting down. And even people who have been practicing meditation for many, many, many years, if they do many hours of meditation in a day, they're likely to encounter a fair amount of physical pain. And of course, just having a body. Bodies occasionally produce pain. That's what they do. So in my case, I've been a little bit sick the last couple of days, so my body's producing more pain than usual. Well, that's the way things are. It's just part of having a body. So we need to learn how to be okay with that. So this then is the practice the Buddha speaks about in the Tikandaki Sutta of things which we normally identify as unpleasant, as repulsive, as things that we want to lean away from. We should practice perceiving them as pleasant. Or at the very least, we should practice perceiving them as not repulsive. We should practice not leaning away from them. We should practice the ability to see them as just what they are, not inherently painful, not inherently pleasant, just sensations. So in the case of meditation practice, once again, so as you're sitting, perhaps practicing mindfulness of the body, though this practice also works with mindfulness of the mind, as we'll talk about in the next Satipatthāna day. When a feeling arises that's painful, instead of trying to ignore it or avoid it, instead of trying to change our body posture to make it go away, instead, stay with a clear, intense, precise awareness of that painful sensation. And practice perceiving it as not painful. Just see it as a strong sensation. It's not inherently painful. It's just a strong sensation. That's all. We have strong sensations and we have mild sensations. That's all. So when there's a strong sensation, well, it's just a strong sensation. We don't need to be bothered by it. We don't need to be upset by it. And we don't need to react to it with aversion, with pushing away. Similarly, when strong, pleasant feelings arise, there's a tendency to get obsessed with them, to get excited. So, for example, when the pizza delivery person knocks at the door, you might notice some excitement and agitation and restlessness arising in the mind. And as it gets carried in and set down on the table, you might notice that restlessness and agitation and excitement building and building and building. Then you actually get your plate of pizza and you start animalistically shoving it into your mouth, then that excitement and restlessness and agitation gets built even higher and higher. Well, what's going on here? What's going on here is that we're having sensations, we're identifying them as pleasant, and then we're getting obsessed with them. And that obsession is agitating the mind. We think it's making us happy, but it's actually just making us restless. We think it's making us happy, but it's actually just making us agitated. So that's something which needs to be closely examined. So then your practice can be, the next time the pizza delivery person comes, remain calm. I know, this is advanced practice, but that's what we do in Buddhism. We do the advanced practices. There's a really lovely sutta from the Samyutta Nikaya, and it's either in the Devata Samyutta or the Devaputta Samyutta. I think it's Devaputta Samyutta. Here we go. Yeah, the Kamada Sutta. So this is Samyutta Nikaya 2.6, the Kamada Sutta. This is the sutta about a deva named Kamada, who his name, by the way, means giver of sensuality, which is highly amusing. Anyway, so the deva named giver of sensuality, Kamada, comes to the Buddha and says, "Oh, it is so hard to do, so hard to do." And the Buddha replies, "We do that which is hard to do." And the sutta continues on from there. And it continues with this exchange of Kamada saying like, "Oh, this is so difficult." And the Buddha saying, "Yeah, it's difficult and we do it anyway." So it's different statements along these lines. In fact, I should translate this sutta. It's a really good one. I'm adding it to my list. But the point there is that, yes, it's difficult, and we do it anyway. Because it's something that's worth doing. It's something that's worth training the mind in. So when painful sensations arise, our tendency is to obsess about them, to obsess about how much we hate them and how much we dislike them. And our tendency is to try to find a way to avoid them, either to ignore them or to suppress them or to turn our attention to something else or to try to move our body to make our body less painful. Or if it's emotions that are painful, then we try to avoid those emotions. We try to cover it up or suppress it or distract ourselves or think about other things. So all of that just fuels our tendency towards aversion and ignorance. It just builds up our defilements and our delusions. So instead, we do that which is hard to do, which is to turn towards the sensations, to look directly at them, and to perceive them as non-repulsive. To look directly at them and to not be repelled by them, to not turn away from them, to not ignore them, but to be completely present and non-reactive. So this is the practice that we can do in relationship to feelings. And once again, this applies equally both to physical sensations and also to mental sensations, to feelings in the mind and objects in the mind, mental objects that provoke a response of pleasure, pain, or neutrality, which is all of them, by the way. So that's all I really have to say on this particular section of Satipatthana. So this is a practice which, if integrated into one's meditation practice, it leads to much deeper samadhi, much deeper serenity, and a deep insight into the nature of happiness and sadness, a deep insight into the nature of pleasure and pain, a deep insight into how we create our own experience of happiness and sadness, pleasure and pain, moment by moment. And as we recognize that, then we can get some control over it. So even if your body is in pain, well, you'll start to recognize that that doesn't mean the mind is in pain. Just because the body is producing sensations that we used to consider painful doesn't mean that we need to be bothered. We can recognize the body is producing sensations that I used to call painful, but that's it. That's as far as it goes. Or when you notice pleasant feelings arising, then you can recognize, oh, I used to get excited and agitated by those feelings, but not anymore. Because I've trained my mind to not be agitated by pleasant feeling. And when neutral feeling arises, you can recognize, oh, I used to ignore these neutral feelings. I used to be oblivious to their existence. I used to consider them boring or uninteresting. But now I can be fully present with them, fully aware of them, without distraction, without dullness, with sharp, clear attention. So this is what we're training the mind towards, to give sharp, clear, impartial attention to whatever arises without pulling away and without leaning in. So that's my thoughts on the Vedana Satipatthāna. At this time, if there's any questions or comments, we can go ahead and take some questions and comments.
Right. Thank you, Bhante, for guiding us. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And we have quite a few questions, actually.
Oh, that's surprising.
So Sally starts with a question regarding yesterday's sutta part. Why in Pali kaya kayana I can't pronounce it. Kaya kayanupasi. Thank you. Kaya kayanupasi. Here, kaya body appears 2 times. So, what's the difference between observe the body versus observe the body as body?
So I spoke a bit about this yesterday, and actually, this is something which pretty much every Satipatthana scholar has their own opinion about why. But my current thought on the matter is, so kaya here means in terms of the body. So in other words, perceiving the body in terms of the body means perceiving the body in its own terms, relating to the body on its own terms, relating to the body on the body's terms. So that means not projecting our ideas of what we think the body is. It means not having our concepts or visualizations of the body, but rather trying to feel the body on its own terms, to feel the body as it is from its own side. So just feeling the body as the body, not the body as we think it is, not the body as we wish it is, not the body as we pretend it to be. So a great example of this was, well, I don't know if it's a great example, but an example of this. A few years ago, I was leading a retreat, which was focused on mindfulness of the body. And there was one person on that retreat who, during the one-on-one consultations, he said, well, I don't get it. I don't get this whole mindfulness of the body thing. And I was like, well, you just focus on feeling your body. And he's like, oh, you mean visualizing my body? And I'm like, no, I mean feeling it. And he's like, well, I guess I can form a mental idea about my body. And I'm like, no, feel your body. This big, hot, meaty chunk of flesh right here. Can't you feel it? And he's like, I don't understand. I don't get it. So this is a case of, this particular gentleman, he has many good qualities, but his particular issue is he was so lost in his ideas about what his body was that he was mostly oblivious to what his body actually is. So then, given the instruction to focus on feeling your body, he was absolutely baffled by this instruction because it's something he wasn't used to doing. He was used to relating to his body as a concept, as his mental projection of what he thinks his body is, rather than the actual experience of the body. So in my opinion, that's the emphasis the Buddha is making here. He's saying, pay attention to the body on its own terms, as it actually is, not as you think it is, not as you wish it was, but as it actually is. Okay.
Thank you. And Ryan says, when practicing sense restraint, I find it really helpful to pay attention to Vedana first and foremost and watch the machinery of craving start to act based on that feeling. I've always heard the physical / non-physical distinction exposited in English exposited in relation to that sutta that distinguishes householder and monastic feelings.
Oh.
Is that not right? Can't remember the exact sutta.
The one where the Buddha talks about the happiness of a householder, the depression of a householder, the happiness of happiness, depression, and equanimity of a householder versus the happiness, depression, and equanimity of a renunciate. That's a great sutta, but it doesn't have anything to do with this one. I wouldn't try to map them together like that. I think that's missing the point of both suttas.
And Mark says, I'm confused. You gave sadness as an example of feeling, yet you said this sutta was not about emotions. Can you explain?
So I brought the example of sadness not as an emotion, but because sadness is a mental object which produces an unpleasant feeling in the mind. So when using the word emotion, I'm referring to a more complex structure, whereas Vedana is simply pleasant, painful, and neutral. That's it. So, for example, anger is not itself pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral, but it produces mostly unpleasant, often a little bit of pleasant, but mostly unpleasant feeling, unpleasant Vedana. So anger is one thing. The Vedana, the feeling of unpleasantness that arises dependent on the anger, is something else. So this section of the Satipatthāna Sutta is not going into analysis or description or examination of emotions per se, just as it's not going into examination or description of physical sensations, but rather into the response, the reactive tendency that we have to whatever's arising in body and mind. So, for example, this sutta is not talking about sight, sound, smell, taste, and touch. And yet, any one of those can produce Vedana. So it's purely interested in looking at the Vedana itself, coming to understand how we experience pleasant, painful, and neutral, and getting some control over the pleasant, painful, and neutral process. And this is universal because it actually applies equally to any source of Vedana. If you understand Vedana itself, then it doesn't matter what source it's coming from, because it's all just Vedana. So this part of Satipatthana is learning how to separate Vedana from the source of the Vedana. It's learning how to recognize that it's not cilantro that's inherently vile and disgusting, although it certainly seems that way, but rather cilantro is one thing, and the experience of unpleasantness is another. It's not pizza that's inherently fabulous and wonderful, though it certainly seems that way, but rather pizza is one thing, and the experience of pleasantness is another. So it's learning how to recognize the feeling of pleasantness and unpleasantness itself. And you recognize that the feeling of unpleasantness is exactly the same whether it's arising from cilantro or from sadness or from stepping on a sharp object or from remembering your dead grandmother or whatever it is. It's just unpleasant. And the feeling unpleasant is just the feeling unpleasant, and that's it. And everything else is just a bunch of mental proliferation that we add on top of it. It's just a bunch of conceptualization. And that layer of mental and emotional proliferation is something that we'll get into in the later parts of this sutta. Okay?
Bradley asks, so I shouldn't include cilantro in the meal offerings tomorrow?
I would personally prefer not.
Can be on the side. There are others who would appreciate that, and others who might have an unpleasant sensation arising.
I'll put it this way: of the people in this room, 33% of them do not want to eat cilantro, and approximately 67% do want to eat cilantro. So do with that knowledge as you will.
So Bhante is basically one of the rare people in the world.
We're not rare. It's 10% of the population.
But still rare. It's not that often that perceives cilantro as soap. So that's the sanya that appears with cilantro. The rest of the people in the room, though, have quite the pleasant sensation arising. Anyway, scrolling back up, James had said, but I don't know if it's still relevant. He said, I'll come clean. I haven't understood these feeling instruction sutta. Question: can observation of the sense basis and feelings work for this? I'm still very lost. These make zero sense to me. I think you've addressed it already.
I hope so. Yeah.
Yeah. So if there's like a further question, James, feel free to type it up. And Kevin says, aha, so this is speaking to the pleasant/rapturous feelings we mentioned towards the end of last night's talk.
Yeah, that's included. Yeah.
And Boone says, Bhante, what is it meant by the word understand in the sutra? Is it the same as awareness?
Yeah, I mean, the Pali word is pajanati. So pajanati, it's actually related to the word panya. So to discern, to clearly know with wisdom, to wisely know something. So it has this implication of direct, complete experiential understanding of something. So not necessarily an intellectual understanding, but rather a direct, wise knowing of something. Okay? So the Pali pajana and panya are two different forms, which in Sanskrit is simply one form, prajna. So prajna in Sanskrit, in Pali there's two different words, panya and pajana, but all three of these words are directly related to each other, and they all have basically the same meaning.
And Kevin says, I struggle with differentiating neutrality from equanimity. Is this an issue with semantics or translation?
So in this case, neutral is indicates a sensation to which one does not react with either desire or aversion. Neutrality as a state of mind, in Pali, there's actually a word for that, which is majjata, or tatra majjata, but this word is quite rare. Majjata, it's quite rare in the suttas. We don't see it very often. It quite literally means middleness, like in the middle about something. It's quite rare. You don't see this much in the suttas. More the distinction that we normally make is between equanimity and apathy. So apathy is where you're not reacting to something because you don't care. And you're not really paying any attention because you don't really care. So apathy contains a subtle trace of aversion and delusion, an element of willful ignorance. Whereas with equanimity, one is fully aware and one is not reacting with either desire or aversion. But it's full awareness. And full awareness of what's happening, so that one's neutrality is not coming from disinterest. One's neutrality is not coming from a lack of awareness or ignorance, but rather one's neutrality is coming from recognizing that partiality is dukkha. So it's neutrality coming from a wise knowing that reactivity and partiality is dukkha, and non-reactivity and impartiality is not dukkha. That's the distinction there. Okay.
All right. And James says cilantro tastes great.
To some people, I heard that's true.
And he follows up on the question he asked earlier. I still don't get if watching sense spaces is cheating out watching feeling, even though I'd experience and watch them as well. This and the mind sati section tripped me up.
Well, we're not yet to the mind section, so we'll talk about the mind section when we get to the mind section. So yeah, it's very difficult to directly approach Vedana. So normally we approach Vedana through the medium of the six senses. So that's perfectly valid. So starting with awareness of the six senses, the awareness of the sense spaces, recognize the sensations that are happening, sight, sound, smell, taste, touch, thought. Recognize the labeling of pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral that we place on the sensations. And try to notice that feeling of pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral itself. Try to separate apart the Vedana itself from the sensory information. So for example, right now I'm looking at a black phone, and I happen to like the color black. I find it peaceful and soothing. So I'm having a pleasant Vedana. So black is not inherently pleasant. Other people look at the color black and they find it unpleasant. They find it dark and gloomy, or they find it depressing, or they find it boring, or whatever. I find it peaceful and soothing. So trying to separate apart that feeling of pleasantness from the sight of a black color. Recognize that it's two different things. Okay?
And Reed, Reed says, at the risk of calling myself out publicly, dealing with boredom during longer sits is still a problem for me. Would a solution here to be simply see boredom as an unpleasantness producing sensation? That is, to separate the boredom from the unpleasant discomfort I'm reacting to it with. Am I understanding properly?
Yeah, you could try that. I mean, the most direct way of dealing with boredom is just to take an interest in the meditation. Then the boredom evaporates. My preceptor likes to say, you're only bored when you're not mindful. So it's only when we're not paying close, intense, interested attention to our experience. It's only then that we're not. It's only then that we're bored. So when you pay close attention to your experience, you're not bored. So when you notice you're starting to get bored, well, just pay closer attention, and the boredom evaporates. It's actually magical how this works. It's pretty special. You're like, oh, this is so boring. And then you start focusing on the body. You're like, oh, how fascinating. And the boredom's gone, just like that. Try that. But your idea of trying to separate out the feeling of unpleasantness associated with boredom, that would be Vedana-nupassana, Vedana Satipatthāna. So yeah, that's a perfectly valid practice. And if you want to try that out and see what happens, go for it. See how it goes.
And Gabriela says, ironically, this practice of Vedana-nupassana is much easier for me because I feel by noticing unpleasant experience, I notice it being sorted, and I consider this as addressing the pain. Should I try resisting noting and labeling the Vedana?
Can you read that again, please?
Ironically, this practice of Vedana Nupassana is much easier for me because I feel by noticing unpleasant experience, I notice it being sorted, and I consider this as addressing the pain. Should I try resisting noting and labeling the Vedana?
Well, it's a matter of result. So in this case, we're trying to clearly recognize Vedana, trying to clearly recognize the reactive tendency that we have to sensation, and ultimately to cultivate equanimity, to be aware of the sensations without reacting to them. So that's the result that we're aiming at. So the question is, does your practice bring you to that result? So earlier, yesterday, you said that your tendency is to repress and ignore painful sensation, which is why it continues to harass you. So if possible, that the practice that you've been using is not working. It's possible that it's just avoiding the problem rather than addressing it. But that's for you to look at your own mind and see what's going on there. If we're practicing correctly, then as time goes by, pain becomes less bothersome. So even intense pain doesn't bother us. So my pain tolerance now is massively higher than it was 20 years ago. Unbelievably. Not even in the same category.
And Ryan says, this is the approach I took with my recent depression episode. View it as just sensation and not something to react against.
How did that go? That sounds encouraging.
He doesn't say more about that, but if he does, I will definitely read it out and share.
Yeah, because if that worked, that's wonderful. That's great.
Marielle says, sometimes feeling our bodies might mean confronting pain, which we don't want to. Detaching ourselves from the body and experiencing as a concept perhaps doesn't hurt as much.
Yeah, that's a big problem, this whole detaching from the body, trying to avoid your pain. Yeah, that's a huge problem. You need to learn how to face your pain without being bothered by it. So don't ignore it. Don't disconnect from it. Turn directly towards it. See it for what it is and recognize that you don't need to be bothered by it. This is freedom. Freedom is the ability to face any sensation without flinching. That's freedom. Freedom is not running away and hiding from certain kinds of sensations. That's not freedom. That's entrapment. Okay?
Gabriela says, ironically, as someone who suffers from pain, confronting the unpleasant Vedana directly helps lessen the pain. But when you're trying to get full attention of the body, Vedana very much tries its best to be in direct control of your attention. So it interferes with the Kaya Nupassana. But directly looking at the pain itself also makes the pain vanish after a while, leaving a cool or hot feeling.
Yeah, then you can switch between the two as needed. So when practicing mindfulness of the body, if you're starting to get overwhelmed by painful Vedana, then you can switch to practicing Vedana Nupassana until you get that under control. And then you can go back to doing Kaya Nupassana. Yeah, that's fine. And eventually you'll get to a point where you can just stay with mindfulness of the body and your samadhi will grow very strong. But yeah, you might need to switch back and forth between the two for a while, and that's okay.
And Jen says, Bhante, is it correct to say, in a sense, feeling does not really exist in an independent state? There is not anything which is truly unpleasant. It is changing conditions.
Yeah.
A cold glass of water is pleasant on a hot day. A cold glass of water after being outside in the cold all day is unpleasant. The water has not changed, merely the conditions.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Yeah.
Except for cilantro.
Well, no, because in my condition it's unpleasant, and in your condition it's pleasant.
No, but I mean how you experience the conditions. So Sally says, could Bhante explain more about what Bhante mentioned at the end, provoke the mental Vedana? I have to work on Vedana from mental object a lot. Thanks.
Yeah, it's the same. So when a mental object appears, notice that you have a reactive tendency, a tendency to react with either liking or disliking. There's a habit of either leaning towards the mental object or leaning away from it. So notice that tendency. Notice the sense of pleasantness or unpleasantness associated with it. And practice bringing the mind towards a peaceful, calm recognition of the object without reacting. Okay?
Mm-hmm. And Gabriela says, feeling tones like a field of qualities that the mind experiences, and those pleasant experiences draw one's field of awareness like a black hole and leave a huge hole in our awareness where the neutral feelings are. And there are huge repulsion fields around unpleasant Vedana. So think of it as a field of qualities being moved around violently by craving and aversion. Any thoughts on that?
That's very poetic.
And Boone says, Bhante, can I say Vedana and Upassana speed up wisdom when practiced as compared to mindfulness of the body? Ooh.
Speed up wisdom?
I guess he says practicing Vedana and Upassana speeds the development of wisdom.
I would just say there are different ways of practicing. I wouldn't necessarily say that one is faster than another. Yeah. They also support each other. But yeah, I wouldn't necessarily say that one is superior to the other. Yeah. I wouldn't say that.
And Sally, keeping it real. I like it when something feels good. How do I overcome this?
Yeah, that's pretty common. Yeah, so just recognize the excitement and the attachment in the mind when you're caught up in liking something. Notice the agitation and the fear of loss when you're attached to something pleasant. Notice the discomfort of trying to get pleasant things. Like that craving to go on Amazon and buy a bunch of worthless junk when you know you don't have the money for it. It's like, well, how does that feel? Not so great. Not very nice. Or you actually do buy some worthless junk and then it shows up in the mail and you're like, well, actually, this isn't really as great as it was in my imagination. Or the pizza shows up at the door and you start eating it and you're like, oh, they put too much oil on the pizza. Oh. Or maybe it's actually fabulous, but then you have a stomachache afterwards. So, yeah, just recognizing the drawbacks. Recognizing the drawbacks. This is one of the most potent ways of dealing with our obsession with pleasant things. Recognize the drawbacks. The drawbacks of that obsession. Notice how the obsession makes us unhappy immediately in the present moment, and it leads to us making bad choices. Recognize the drawbacks. Okay.
And Gabriela says, meanwhile, my second question is, I have a more difficult time trying to separate the black hole fields of craving than the repulsion fields of experience. So while my pain doesn't cause me distress, I can't control being drawing in by craving as much.
Yeah, it's a bit more difficult to see the drawbacks of pleasant sensation because it's pleasant and we like pleasant things. So as I was just saying to Sally, it's really important to cultivate awareness of the drawbacks of attachment to pleasantness. Recognize how that disturbs the mind. And recognize how it weakens our samadhi. It prevents us from developing samadhi. It weakens our mindfulness because then we start ignoring the rest of our experience and fixating on the one pleasant thing. And of course, it's absolutely destructive to equanimity. We can't have any equanimity at all when we're obsessed with pleasantness. So it undermines mindfulness, samadhi, and equanimity, which are the basic necessary qualities for good meditation practice.
And Bradley says, so when we're observing feelings, we're observing our perception of something as pleasant, neutral, or unpleasant, rather than something that is objectively one way or another.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
And
by the way, for those who are fine with the cilantro example, another one would be, if you're familiar with Chinese food, they have this thing called stinky tofu, which virtually every single non-Chinese person regards as utterly vile and disgusting, and virtually every single Chinese person regards as absolutely fabulous.
So apparently it has some fans also amongst the Burmese.
A similar example is Durian fruit, which is a fruit from Southeast Asia, which similarly, people from that part of the world tend to find fabulous and wonderful, and people from the rest of the world mostly find utterly disgusting.
And Kevin says, what we resist persists.
Okay, next question.
Dan asks, how do we avoid obsessing with particular Vedana? For example, a full-blown toothache. It would be quite loud, call for attention again. Maybe we can give it some time. See dance of sharp, hot jabbing. Do we observe other sensations, somewhat ignoring, or do we go with just the predominant sensation arising?
Well, it depends on the practice that you're trying to do. If you're trying to develop samadhi, then you just stay with your samadhi object, and that's it. Just let the pain be in the periphery of your attention and not get involved in it. And if you practice in that way, then the pain disappears because we're not giving it any mental space. We're not giving it any CPU cycles. So there's just no space for your mind to produce pain. So pain is an activity. If we don't give any percentage of our mind to that activity, then there won't be any pain. If you put 100% of your mind on your samadhi practice, then you won't experience pain because you're not giving any room for the mind to create pain. So that's one approach. If you're trying to develop some insight into the nature of the sensation, then yeah, you should turn your attention towards it and focus on feeling it. And in particular, try to get in touch with the sensation that underlies the pain. So recognizing that there is simply a sensation in your teeth in this example. And the sensation itself is not pain, it's just sensation. Then recognize that you have a tendency to dislike, a tendency to lean away from that sensation. And that leaning away creates the experience of pain. And then recognize that the pain, the feeling of pain in the mind, is something distinctly separate from the sensation in your teeth. So you can piece apart the components of the experience in this way. And you'll also recognize that there's a distinct volitional component to the mental experience of pain. There's something we're doing that's making it happen. And if we stop doing that, then the pain will disappear, even though the sensation in the teeth remains. That's one approach. Another approach is to practice the recognition of impermanence. You touched on this a bit in what you were saying. So recognizing that the sensation in your teeth is constantly changing. Sometimes it's strong, sometimes it's mild, sometimes it's jabbing, sometimes it's throbbing, sometimes it feels small, sometimes it feels big. So it's constantly changing. And actually, every once in a while, it's just not there. This is a really interesting thing to watch for. If you feel like you have chronic pain, watch. And you'll notice that every once in a while, it's just not there. The pain is just gone for no particular reason. There's just no pain. Sometimes just for a fraction of a second, sometimes for several seconds, sometimes for longer even. But every now and then, the pain is just gone. And then a little while later, the pain reappears, but it's always different. It's always changing. So you can also start to be fascinated with the changingness of the pain. It's very interesting. And when you're interested, you're not aversive. And when you're interested and not aversive, then you're not creating the experience of painful Vedana, which means it stops hurting.
And Ryan is giving some information on what he was talking about earlier with depression. So he says, it went really well. I was able to greet the depression as an old friend. I still had to take a couple days off to deal with it, but it was not as unpleasant as it used to be. Great.
Well done.
Yeah, sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And Mehmet says, isn't Vedana a type of our labeling and perceptions towards the actual experience?
Yeah, that's part of it. Yeah.
Wow, there's lots of questions.
Dear Lord, the shortest section of the Satipatthana gets the most questions.
I knew it. You did not trust, but I know. James says, sense basis got me to finally face the feelings that came from repetitive thoughts. I used to hide a lot from them. And also says, too much oil on the pizza. Wait, this is a problem?
Actually, yes. There really is such a thing as too much.
And Sally says, should I change sanya towards harsh criticizing, a good thing to train decreasing self-image? In terms of Anguttara Nikaya 5.144 Sutta's method of switching aversion to lean. So when I receive criticism, I can even feel good because it's helping my practice. Is this the correct way to change the Vedana according to that sutta?
You can certainly practice in that way. What I would actually recommend, though, is try to aim for just not being bothered. That's really best. But yeah, it is true. When you're being criticized, often you're getting some useful information there. And our negative reaction is because of our sense of self, our attachment to me. We think that person is attacking me, but actually they're not attacking you. They're just attacking some impermanent, impersonal components, which you've made the mistake of thinking is you. It's quite a bit different. Again, what the Buddha says in the sutta is perceiving it as non-repulsive. So not leaning away from something. But that's not the same as leaning into something. It just means not leaning away. So not leaning away, but just staying upright as it comes at you. That's the practice I would recommend. And that seems to be the practice the Buddha is recommending. Okay.
And Nora says, I get not getting too attached to pain or pizza, but what about love? What does it mean to practice those ideas in relation to love?
Not attached to pain or pizza. That's also poetic. There's lots of poetry in the comments today. This is great. Well, it depends on what you mean by love. So in English, the word love has quite a range of meanings. And in a Buddhist context, when we talk about love, we're mostly talking about metta. We're talking about metta, karuna, mudita, upekkha. We're talking about the Brahma Viharas. That's really what we mean. So the question is, what do you mean by love? You'll need to answer that before I can answer.
And Bradley says, I find myself feeling nostalgic for the past or even for experiences I've never had, like wishing I had experienced something in the past. Is this a kind of feeling that can be observed using the Satipaṭṭhāna Sutta?
Yeah, that's more in the category of mindfulness of mind, which we'll come to next weekend. But yeah, that feeling of nostalgia, pure poison. Don't give in. It's just dukkha. It's just dukkha. That's all. Don't get involved. Okay?
Reed says, durian tastes like it smells, and it smells like old socks soaked in sewage.
That's a very accurate description.
I think May disagrees. Do you like durian, May?
Durian?
Durian. Don't you have? Oh, yes.
So our resident Southeast Asian, of course, likes durian.
Sweet. It is sweet.
I strongly disagree. So my first experience with durian, I was staying at a monastery in Taiwan. And one day I walked into the dining hall and it smelled like dirty gym socks soaked in raw sewage. And the whole dining hall, and this was a big hall, like it's a hall that's designed to fit like 100, 150 people. The whole hall absolutely reeked of like open sewer with dirty gym socks. And I was like, this is so unbelievably foul. What on earth is this? And it was because that day there was fresh durian fruit for everyone. Anyway, totally beside the point.
I don't know if I've had durian or not.
You would know. You would know.
Maybe I liked it, actually.
Okay.
I do remember stinky tofu not liking that.
Next time we're in Asia, we'll get you some fresh durian. You'll find out very quickly whether or not you like it.
All right. So Sally says, so in meditation, how to observe the mental object separate from reaction? Could Bhante give an example? For example, just observe the criticize as words, observe the mental reaction followed.
Yeah, that's one way. Yeah. If you want to get a bit more precise, there's the words, there's the meaning of the words, then there's the reaction to the meaning of the words. So there's actually 3 layers there. There's also the reaction to the tone of the words. And you might notice that there's a reaction even before the person starts talking. So there's actually a lot to observe in that process, which is part of what makes it so difficult, because it brings up so many different layers of reactivity in our mind. So it can be quite challenging to piece apart what's going on. When someone's criticizing us, it's many different things happening. It's different. Like when you just step on a sharp object, that's very straightforward. It's not a very complex experience. It can be quite unsettling, but it's not complex at all. But when another person is criticizing us, that brings up several layers of reactivity, several different kinds of mental reaction. So it's a much more complex experience, which makes it much harder to process correctly.
And Boone says, durian, yay.
Must be Southeast Asian.
And Marielle says, I think durian tastes good but smells horribly. If this is the fruit I think it is, it's all about eating it without smelling it.
That's an interesting idea. We have approval from May.
Yeah, nod. Okay, we're understanding the tricks of the trade. And so Nada is elaborating on the question on love. So example, love for a partner.
Yeah, that's still not helping. Because again, what do you mean?
I think it's the whole love without attachments. Now, we actually did a little talk about it.
Yeah.
A few weeks ago, I don't remember. It's been quite a long time now.
Yeah. So again, ultimately, what we're aiming at in Buddhist practice is, love without attachment. So loving kindness, compassion, empathy, and equanimity towards the person without expecting anything, without craving anything, without obsession, with the willingness to let go. That's all fine. And noticing the dukkha that comes when there's attachment mixed in or expectation mixed in.
Right, and then last comment by Jen that says, in regards to pain, I unfortunately had 2 years of chronic pain. What helped me was using metta when the pain would arise. My mind would be infused with metta rather than aversion. And Sally says, for today's meditation method, after we observe the mental reaction, we see there's dukkha feeling. Then we just stay on observing the dukkha feeling the rest of the time.
Well, actually, what tends to happen is that when you directly observe the dukkha feeling, it tends to dissolve. So in that case, I would recommend that you just return to mindfulness of the body as your foundation. Okay.
All right, and that was all. So thank you so much, Bhante, for sharing the teachings. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And thank you all for working on your practice. We will be meeting again at 2:30 p.m. today for a special guided meditation by Bhante Suddhāso. And then this evening again at 7:30 p.m. All right, so have a great day of practice.